Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have a really very special guest, and this is very personal for me, and I'll explain soon. Our guest is the Debbie Hepplewhite. Yay, Debbie! And before I get into her bio or the article, I just want to take us back a little bit because I've known Debbie for many, many years. When I first started to even learn about phonics, just the word phonics, it was years ago when I read this book and I was trained in a program called phonographics. And I had just all these leveled books. And I was looking to find out, well, what match the work that I'm doing. And I found this Yahoo group started by my friend who had passed away, Dick Schutz, and it was called Read by Grade 3. It was a Yahoo group. They don't even use Yahoo groups anymore. And this goes back many, many years ago. And there was this English woman, this British woman on there who was so vocal, but everything that came out of her mouth was gold. And I have to say, I have very few mentors in this space. I have to say, Debbie Hepplewhite certainly is one of my heroes in this space. She spoke out. She was changing the UK by the minute when the United States didn't even know anything about structured literacy. And this goes back years ago. They had this phonics check that they got in years ago. All these things that we're just starting to pick up on now. Even though we tried when I was part of Reading First to make these changes, but we went right back, and we're going to talk about how this can slip back, everyone. So as many times as we think we're moving forward, it's so easy to slip back. And so there's a lot of history here that we'll be talking about. So let me tell you a little bit about Debbie Hepplewhite. Debbie has the title MBE, FRSA. Now, she met Queen Elizabeth. I thought her title was Dame Debbie, but she is the member of the Order of the British Empire. Ooh. Anyhow, and we Americans don't really understand any of this, but I consider Debbie at this point part of the royal clan. So the only thing we know here is about the crown, Debbie, watching the crown. So she is an MBE, FRSA, a former teacher, special needs teacher, and head teacher. Debbie has campaigned extensively over many years to achieve national, research-informed, systematic synthetic phonics teaching in primary schools. And you will know what that means. SSP, we're going to start off with that. As a representative of the UK Reading Reform Foundation, former editor of the RRF newsletter, founder of the RRF website, and honorary committee member, she advised the British government for the parliamentary inquiry Teaching Children to Read, March 2005, and she helped to inform Sir Jim Rose's independent review of the teaching of early reading. And that final report came out March 2006. And believe me, I downloaded that when it happened. And I was rooting for Debbie and Jim Rose. It was a very exciting moment in my life. In 2012, Debbie was awarded an MBE in the Queen's New Year's Honors List for services to education. Debbie is known to be a controversial and inspirational speaker and has spoken alongside Sir Jim Rose at literacy conferences and at several research ed conferences. She provides phonics consultancy services internationally. And if any of you have ever heard of Phonics International, that is Debbie's work. She has many other programs that she has authored, No Nonsense Phonics. She has been part of Oxford Reading Tree, Floppy's Phonics Sounds, and there's a whole slew of things that we will put in the show notes. So no need to go on any further than introducing the Debbie Hepplewhite. And the article that we are going to be looking at today, which was also controversial, I might add, came out of France, translated to English, and it is the effectiveness of teaching methods for learning to read. Contributions from the Formalect survey. I hope I'm saying that right. And let's see, this came out and it was determined, and I'll just take a quote from it, that implementing a strict synthetic phonics method, that is to say, a method focused on teaching the code of grapheme phoneme correspondences without any accompanying memorization activities or global recognition of non-decodable words, is more effective for the acquisition of good fluency and reading comprehension. So before we could dive into that quote, Debbie, please explain to our audience what SSP is. My partner, Judy Boxner, is a coach in New York City, and she is very familiar with phonics, but I don't think SSP is a very familiar term here in the United States. So she and a lot of other people need you to clarify. Welcome, Debbie. You can unmute yourself. Yes.
Right. Hello, everyone. I mean, how do you follow that? Before I talk about what systematic synthetic phonics means or how we define it, I just need to say one thing. You mentioned Dick and you mentioned Sir Jim Rose, and I would like to mention people like Bob Sweet and Reed Lyon. There are so many people who are the generation before me, if you like, and this has been an international teamwork thing for many decades. And so actually, although England, in a sense, seems as if it's leading the way, actually, we built on the work that had been done in the USA and Canada even. And so for a considerable length of time, there's been this disconnect between research findings and what we put into the classroom. And the National Reading Panel from the US did a really good job to try to summarize their findings with a scrutiny of classroom practice, if you like, to do that. And we built on that. So Jim Rose and his team of inspectors built on that in England. And we had parliamentary inquiries. So it was a big thing to work out how to teach reading. And also in my work in the classroom and in writing phonics programs, I've built on the shoulder of giants. So although I'm extremely honored and humbled with the description you're giving of me, I myself want to acknowledge that I'm just one of a team. We are a team, an international team. Now, systematic synthetic phonics, the systematic part is really saying we need to teach the letter sound links of the spelling system, the alphabetic code, explicitly and incrementally, and not leave that to chance. So the argument has been, do we do it incidentally? Do we do it through authentic literature and so on? And so we've had to refine what systematic looks like and what incidental looks like. And later on, we might get a chance to talk about how that has evolved certainly in England's context in various phonics programs, because I'm still a critic, ladies. I've still got lots of concerns about what's going on. Now, so synthetic is purely referring to the verb to synthesize, which means to blend the sounds. When we see letters and letter groups, say the sounds, sound out and blend, to decode or to discern. I prefer the word to discern, the target spoken word. So that's where the word synthetic comes from. But certainly what's very strong in England's context is that the teaching principles include the teaching of spelling as well. So Sir Jim Rose, in his 2006 world-renowned report, really made it very, very simple. We teach the alphabetic code systematically. We understand that it's reversible. We teach sounding out and blending for reading, and we teach oral segmenting and allotting letters and letter groups for spelling. And in a nutshell, that was his description, which was really beautiful. And then the argument progressed because we were also noting that why would you teach that code and then confront little children with reading books to read with code in that they had not yet been taught? And that's the traditional way of doing it. And the punitive part of that for children was that in the classroom and at home, we asked them to read their little reading books aloud independently. And when they couldn't lift the words off the page, we were saying, well, look at the picture and the guess, read on the sentence and guess what you think that word would be. And so we were really taking extremely young children and expecting them to read aloud words that they had not been taught to read. And this links perfectly into this French summary paper, where it's trying to identify different approaches in the classroom. Now, we had problems in England because somebody coined the phrase that phonics needs to be first, fast, and only. And that became something which really was not clarified for anybody, for academics or researchers, because it seemed to suggest that we have this diet of this strict, decodable material, where actually we weren't saying that. We were saying children are exposed to all manner of literature, but they weren't asked to read independently aloud to an adult books that they could not read. So the issue became the multi-cueing reading strategies, what they are and what they're not. And all that really needed to be was a shift in understanding of the teachers, the teacher educators, and the parents and carers at home. Don't ask a child to read a word the child cannot read, or we haven't equipped them to read. So the multi-cueing reading strategies were really, at fault here. But we also had phonics programs that did not have cumulative decodable phonics reading books. So they were good phonics programs and they were teaching the letter sound correspondences. But then when children were asked to read their reading book, it still could be, words in there that they couldn't lift off the page. Now, another complication is that there are some children who are precocious readers and, in a sense, code breakers, that they've had the capacity to start to deduce the code for themselves to be able to read those words. But then people were saying at home, but we expose the children to all of that and they're still not able to read. So there became an argument between, is the child dyslexic? Has the child got learning difficulties or not? Do we need to give them something different? And ironically, there are still people who are in the professional, the dyslexic professional angle of this, who will say that phonics doesn't suit those dyslexic children. And it's like, oh my goodness, the messages that teachers themselves get and that tutors get are so muddled to this day. So basically then, there are advantages to having reading material that children can read that closely matches the code that we have taught them. And over the years, certain phonics programs have then written and published phonics books to go with their phonics program. So in England's context, and I know it's growing in Australia and it may well be growing in America, this notion of having these matched reading books has become very, very important, and it links to this French picture. But I want to add to that, but I really think I should stop talking for a minute to see what direction Faith and Judy would like to take me in next.
Well, Debbie, if you saw our faces, you would know we have to give you a big cheers. So we didn't show this to you, but we have a cheers button as well as a BS button. So big cheers for you. So Judy, you and I have spoken about decodable books. When Judy was teaching phonics and we started to communicate, I was a big advocate of using decodables. And she was like, at the beginning, she still loved, aspects of her leveled books. But once she started using the decodables, she was like hooked on what she was seeing in the advances. And I'm going to turn it over to Judy Boxner now. Go ahead, Judy. Tell us about your experiences.
All right. So everybody that watches the Literacy View knows that a lot of my experience in the early days of my teaching career, starting in 2000, were in balanced literacy. Then I was trained in reading recovery. We were extremely attached to leveled literacy. We had these books. They were fun. They were exciting. They weren't helping kids. And I am very proud to say that I have fully shifted for my early readers to using decodables, because I think that they are so powerful in helping kids transfer skills that they're learning in isolation during their phonics block. And I'm really proud to say that this summer, Faith, you inspired me. I'm a very different person than I was I've been in the structured literacy world, I would say about 8 years, but my full shift into using decodables for my earliest readers is about 2 or 3 years old, to going fully that way. And I presented this summer from Manhattanville University in New York City in Westchester, not New York City, in Westchester, on how and why to shift away from leveled literacy and use decodables. And guess what? I had a full house of people that were just as excited as I was. And, the truth of the matter is, when you really start to understand these things fully is when you work with kids in the classrooms, or you're working with kids one-on-one, and you see how confusing it could be for many kids to learn one way in the classroom and then be told to guess words or to problem solve using the pictures. And that causes such a confusion in the brain for so many students. And I speak about my student that is now a fluent and successful reader going into 3rd grade. He was the one that he literally looked me in the face. He was like 6 or 7 years old. And he said, Miss Judy, I'm just so confused. You're telling me to do this. The teacher's telling me not to sound out the word. She's telling me not to look at the letters. And after that moment, there was no looking back. And that child is now a successful reader. We used decodable text for a short window of time so that he could really fully break that code. He knew all those word patterns. He wasn't looking at the picture anymore. He was taking his finger. He was sliding at point of difficulty to make those sounds and prioritize taking what he learned in his phonics block and in his phonemic awareness instruction and actually apply it into text. And I think the most important thing in reading is that application piece, and that decodable text really helps solidify that transference and that application. So yeah, there's no looking back. There's no looking back.
Something very important, and I want to shift this to Debbie right now. Debbie, Judy mentioned a short window of time. In this paper that we're talking about today, I think that's where the confusion is. People were private messaging me, why are you posting about this and supporting this? Because it seems to lead people back to the idea that everything is phonics, and nothing else. Could you talk, Debbie, about what you would recommend in terms of how do we use these types of books, materials that align with phonics? What's the dose? How long? And when do we make that shift? And does that happen in an incidental way? So you know where I'm going, Debbie. I want you to talk about your incidental phonics because I use it. I'm listening. I know you wonder if people listen to you. I listen, Debbie. Please talk about it.
Right. Okay. Great. Right. We're really going to get into the minutiae now. I want to try to encourage people to get into the head of Debbie. Right. Because the head of Debbie is just a highly practical person as opposed to a phonics person. Right. When I read this French paper translated to English, and it talked about an examination of the textbooks in classrooms in France, and it broke them down into strictly synthetic phonics, partial synthetic phonics, multi-cueing, and it was quite shocking the small percentage of teachers who seemed to be knowledgeable and applying what they call the strict synthetic phonics approach, but I've got worries about that. So being practical, like many other research findings of even some really renowned researchers across the world, over and again, I read that paper and I'm thinking, that paper hasn't really told me what the provision looks like in the classroom. So I tried to look up some of their named textbooks online and I couldn't find anything, although I'm sure a better sleuther would find those things. So I felt completely ill-equipped to have a proper view of that paper summaries. So I'm the person that comes in with the questions, and also, as Faith is alluding to, I also have some of the answers. So basically the questions from that paper was, well, what is a textbook? Do they mean that that's the phonics program? Do they have phonics programs in France? And what do they look like? Now, a phonics program to me are things which are explicitly teaching the code, which is the letters and the letter groups linked to the sounds, and then the reversible skills of sounding out and blending for reading, orally segmenting for spelling, and providing a body of work to apply and practice in the classroom. So with regards to that French paper, I just got the impression that they've got a very terrible picture of professional knowledge, because it's left to chance what the children get in the classroom. But me being a specialist in this field now for decades, it isn't even enough to say we're doing a systematic synthetic phonics program and we're doing decodable reading books. So in England's context, and with all of the parliamentary inquiry, the Department for Education took a principle that really was outlined by Professor Diane McGuinness. And I know that some of you people who know about phonographics and reading reflex will know about Professor Diane McGuinness. And she was someone, a lovely lady. She's now departed, very sadly. But she came over to England and we made friends with Diane, and she worked closely with some people to do their phonics programs. But even Diane McGuinness learned in our context, and she did some work for the Reading Reform Foundation. And she identified a prototype. She looked at successful practice in the classroom and she said, what have they got in common? And these are the things they have in common. One was to approach phonics from the introduction or the understanding that the English language has around 44 sounds or phonemes, the smallest sounds in speech that can be identified. I note in the French paper, they say they have 36 identifiable phonemes and around 4 spelling alternatives that can be attributed to those or linked to those sounds. So that French alphabetic code is not as complex as the English alphabetic code. So Diane McGuinness said we need to organize our code around the sounds, they come to an endpoint, and then we need to know what spelling alternatives there are. And then we have this systematic introduction. And in the English language context, we introduce the sounds and mainly one spelling at first, and then we extend to spelling alternatives and pronunciation alternatives, which is exactly, for example, what the Jolly Phonics program, which is internationally used now to good effect, was already doing. But at that time, Jolly Phonics didn't have decodable reading books. We had to push and say we need these decodable reading books. So Diane's prototype became England's core criteria. So the Department for Education in England outlined a core criteria for a systematic synthetic phonics programs, and then undertook a validation process, which in 2011, there were about 7 programs which were validated, 2 of mine included. But it was revisited in about 2021. And the Department for Education got flooded, and there are now 45 validated programs. But I have grave concerns, because at least some of them I would never have validated. I think they are flawed, and I think they are impoverished. Now, Faith, we can't hear you. You need to unmute.
Thank you.
That was really funny. You were teaching, you were showing Debbie how to unmute.
Of course, and I do it myself. So I just want to stop you a second, because what I want to really focus on is this idea of dose and when we make that shift. I don't really want to start evaluating all the other phonics programs. Kind of want to stick to this issue because, again, Americans, we don't know the vast array of all the different phonics programs that were approved there. What we need for internationally is this idea of when do we make that shift? And from using decodables into, more authentic work, because the way the paper is laid out doesn't really say, it says the first few weeks that you have strict adherence to SSP, but it doesn't really say when, how. That's what I really would like to get at right now. Sorry.
I'm kind of leading to that, but I'm pontificating and going a long way round about it. What I'm trying to say now, I'm going to introduce the notion of impoverished phonics, because that shift is dependent on the quality and quantity of the phonics content in the first place. And so really, when you look, recently a lovely lady, Alison Clark from Australia, that you will know, and she represents Spelphabet. Her little organization is Spelphabet. She's just done a video taking a handful of decodable reading books, and we're talking about decodable reading books, to hold teachers' hand to evaluate them. So she's taken well-known published reading books. And I'm looking at those reading books and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, they are so vocabulary poor. They are so restricted. They have very short words, CV, CVC, rather than longer, more complex words. And so if the phonics program's application is only through the reading books and not through worksheets or activity books or workbooks, whatever you want to call them, with rich content, the children's practice and application is what I call very impoverished. Now, if the diet of children is phonics impoverished, even if it's systematic synthetic phonics, some children will still do well because they're picking up language and reading beyond their phonics program. They maybe get it at home. They've maybe got a natural propensity to crack that code for themselves, shared set for variability, common sense, discerning the word according to their spoken language. So some children with weak phonics provision can still take a leap. Now, those precocious readers should not be prevented from a rich literature, or what you call authentic literature, if they're managing it, unless they start a guessing habit. Because guessing wildly is not going to serve them in the longer term. They still need good phonics provision. So basically, this is where your classroom practice and your tutoring, Judy, is so important. Because when we have, in England, the class size might be 30 children. When you've got 30 children in your class, they're wide and varied in their spoken language, in their capacity to learn. But not only that, increasingly in all our countries, we've got children of multiple languages. We're not only teaching our main language of the country to the speakers, native speakers. We're also trying to teach children from other languages as well. And so basically where you're trying to say, and the French paper is trying to say, oh, we only need to do decodable readers for a certain length of time. I'm saying, well, it depends on your phonics program. It depends on how much practice the children get. And you also have to look at the children as individuals. And what I'm saying to you is that I see very impoverished practice. And this is where my approach, Faith, which you've mentioned, my incidental phonics teaching is so important. I absolutely strongly promote the alphabetic code as a tangible alphabetic code chart for all the stakeholders, for the phonics programs, because it means that some children will already get a leg up, a hand up for doing their own deductions, and assimilating it themselves. Those precocious children can race ahead of their classmates. But if the phonics program is content rich enough for spelling and writing, they may need to stick with a systematic phonics provision. So phonics isn't something we do for a short period of time and it's job done. And I despair, because in my international networks of researchers, academics, practitioners, tutors, the argument is becoming, are we overdoing phonics at the expense of comprehension? And even my precious, wonderful Jim Rose would talk about time-limited phonics provision. And this is a completely wrong notion, because phonics and alphabetic code phonics skills are lifelong and for literate adults and spellers, and often they don't know. We so subconsciously apply phonics, and I have to show that in teacher training, that to demote phonics as a moment in time and infant teaching and nothing else is delusional.
Yes.
For the whole damn world, it's delusional.
Yes. And I think that's where we want to go with this. So, Judy, there's a lot here. And so Debbie mentioned her alphabetic code charts. So what it would be like what you have, let's say with foundations, a chart where you have either the letter and the different sounds that could be connected to that, or the other way, a sound with multiple spellings. So it's a way for children to look up at a chart if they, let's say, could spell the word by sounds, but they're unsure of which spelling to use. And it, that's just one use of it. But, her alphabetic code charts are amazing and they're free, and we will put that in the show notes as well. Judy, what are some of your thoughts in terms of what Debbie just said about some programs could really be lacking in many ways? And therefore, when we say about ending it quickly, phonics just ending it quickly, what do you think about that?
Well, I think what's unique about the literacy view in general is we've tried to shift away, and Faith has really helped me with that, thinking more about pedagogy rather than programs, because at the end of the day, we're not on an equal playing field, right? Not every teacher in every classroom is using the most high quality program. Not every teacher has the most high quality materials. So how do we level the playing field with all those pieces? And the way we do that is like really understanding, what does it mean to teach a kid how to read? And how do you really learn how to teach a kid how to read? It's by sitting with a kid and reading. How do you really learn how to teach a class to read? It's by, maybe projecting text on a screen and reading together, doing echo reading, partner reading, really giving kids that feedback. And I think, like, from my own professional experience, it's definitely like what Debbie said. It's not exactly linear for every single kid. So sometimes I'll be working with decodables, right? And generally, I like to introduce kids, and I know Faith is not as in love with syllable types as I am, but I am slightly attached to them, and I've moved away a little bit because I've worked with that vowel flexibility piece as well. But I think it's really important to expose kids to the various things that happen in the English language, like the silent E syllable type, and seeing vowel teams in text. I think a lot of it also, realistically, it looks different for some kids, right? Some kids, like Debbie said, do crack the code quicker than others. And some kids, you could just see, even though you've introduced them to all the different syllable types or the way words work, and it's not as automatic. So I think, sometimes it's a balancing act, right? You work with decodables for a certain amount of time, although in the other parts of your literacy block, you're still doing your rich read alouds. You're still exposing them to that, rich oral language. But I think it's like For instance, I took one kid and I decided, okay, let me see what happens when I take what was formerly one of my level texts. Because once a kid cracked the code, you could use any book, right? You don't necessarily have to throw out those formerly I's, J's, K's, L's. And you see what happens. And sometimes you'll see, wow, the kid sounds phrased and fluent. The kid is working through those words seamlessly. The kid is not guessing at the words, and you're ready to fly. You're reading Aesop's Fables, Rumpelstiltskin. You're reading all different types of texts. But sometimes you see that some kids revert. And the second you show them that type of text and they weren't fully ready, you see the guessing patterns start again. You see that the phrasing and fluency is really, a mess, and that the kids aren't decoding well. So you might need to go back. I don't think that there's an exact formula, but I think that it's very important in K-2 to have those type of texts for different purposes. But that doesn't mean that that's the only type of text kids are going to see once they're closer to, being a fluent reader. So I think it's really being observant.
So this is what I'd like to talk about, Debbie. So you mentioned set for variability, and I mentioned your incidental phonics, which I think both are related. The idea is that you're not just going to say, if you see a word in a book that they haven't gotten to in their phonics sequence, oh, we can't read that word because we didn't get up to it yet in the sequence. You're going to show the kids how the word works. And like you said, you have your alphabetic code charts, and you could say, this is the spelling for this sound. The end. This is how we read the word. This is what the word means. So
can I give Faith a cheers? Faith, you deserve a cheers for that. And the same thing, Faith, you and I were talking about it, right? Some of these decodable texts will have those high frequency words that the kids might not have been exposed to. Just give it to them sometimes if they haven't been exposed to it. Don't sit and have a child struggle on something they haven't worked on yet, right?
Or force them to memorize it, a list of words, to confuse them, where sometimes they're memorizing words and other times they have to sound out words. Well, what are they going to do? They're going to default to what's comfortable. They're going to just try to read everything globally. So I don't want to take this away from Debbie, but that's where I'd like to go with this, Debbie. The idea of, you could be in decodables and be at a certain point in a sequence, but that doesn't mean you're not exposing kids to other types of materials and pointing out the same type of thinking.
Right. I'm really glad of the direction of travel of this conversation. I think it's so important because I want to talk about the purism that becomes damaging when we talk about a pure systematic synthetic phonics approach and so on. And also when we don't reference spelling as well as we do reading, and everything's the reading, teaching of reading. No, we're teaching reading and spelling, and actually spelling is even harder, especially in English spelling. So spelling is so important. Right. My approach is such that we are really never teaching the alphabetic code. Let's take the English language, never mind French at the moment. Let me stick to what I'm familiar with. We're teaching the alphabetic code in a systematic synthetic phonics route, as if the code is in tablets of stone. And it's absolutely not. Some of it is. Occasionally, some of those consonant letter sounds are like fixed, more or less, and the rest isn't. And so we set off with Diane McGuinness's approach, with the core criteria approach, of we start off with some letter sound correspondences, some consonant letter sound correspondences, some vowels, so that we can introduce words very easily and sentences very easily from an early stage. And we're teaching the children right from the beginning, and then we get caught out. And this is a real anecdote. It profoundly changed what I went on to create and promote and train in. Because my little 4-year-old Alice, in my first lesson, when I'm teaching the letter shape, I never face children to do air writing, always face the same way as the children. Don't expect them to reverse thingies. And I'm trying to talk about how writing works and reading works. And I'm doing the very first sound in snake. And Alice pipes up, Mrs. Hepplewhite, I've got that sound in my name, but not that letter shape. A real child, Alice, caught me out on day one of my systematic synthetic phonics program. And I immediately had to think on my feet and think, well, let's see if that's right. And we said Alice's name slowly, and we discovered the sound was in her name. We discovered it was at the end of her name. Then I showed the spelling, and that in her name, this is the code. And I'm going to teach you more about that later. And if the teacher has an alphabetic code overview chart, the teacher can very simply point to say, this is the sound we're doing today. This is the spelling we're doing today that's in some words. But look, the spelling in Alice's name is there. And I'm going to teach you more about that later. So there's one of my very corny expressions. I'm going to teach you more about that later. But Alice understood straight away. Now, you could have had a boy called Josh who's got the letter shape and not the sound. And so when it comes to complicated alphabetic codes, we must set out as teacher educators, not that it's in tablets of stone. So in my approach in my programs, I am making it clear from day one that we're teaching a code. I use the language of the code. I let it be known it's complex in the English language, and it is in French, to be perfectly honest. But don't worry, because I'm always there to help and support them with that. And then I systematically work through that code, and then I've got my reference chart there. It's actually a spelling reference chart above anything else. So that means that in terms of teacher training, I'm actually saying always start in some words. This letter is code for, in a few words, in most words, in nearly all words, in your special name. You have to approach that phonics code teaching on a bit by bit basis. But if you are not trained in that incidental as well as systematic, you don't have that language.
I love that. And that is the key, flexibility of the code, and showing these kids, because poor readers, quite honestly, are looking for rules. They're looking for all the time. And it's not all the time. It's most of the time. It is some of the time. We have to, as teachers, teach flexibility.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, and that starts from the beginning, not patronizing children. And when you're asking me that important question, how long should decodables last? For a child like Alice, in a sense, not very long. So I must make sure that Alice isn't coasting, that Alice's mum isn't going to come to me because she's cross because Alice has put off reading because she's done that phonics, she can do it, she's done it at home. I've got to address that. But if your provision, let's call it your foundational literacy. I like the term foundational literacy and not just phonics, because if your phonics program and provision is vocabulary rich, language rich, you're doing language comprehension, it's not just a phonics program, it's a language program. And in my programs, you will find extremely rich vocabulary, so that actually a child like Alice is still extended. She will know more of the words. She must be able to work through words independently and quickly. And also for spelling, she hasn't, at the age of 4 and 5, got the knowledge of spelling word banks of that bit of code. She hasn't cracked competent letter formation yet. And so I, as a teacher, should know that I'm doing this body of work. I need to be flexible. I need to cater for my precocious Alice and many other children like Alice, but I need to also cater for my second language learner, my child with dyslexic tendencies, my child with impoverished language, my child with global difficulties. I am a class teacher needing to cater for all of that. And in my opinion, we have not yet reached those conversations, not even with the academics and the researchers.
I couldn't agree more. Right? I could not agree more. We have not reached that point at all. Judy, in the paper, it's very interesting. And I think this will apply to the children you work with in New York City. It says here, The relationship between students' entry-level knowledge and reading instruction method can be described as follows. The lower the student's knowledge of the alphabetic principle at the beginning of first grade, the greater the difference in the effectiveness of reading instruction methods. If kids are coming in to school with little understanding, let's say, of this information, you're going to have to stay there longer. What are some of your thoughts, Judy?
Faith, you hit it on the money, bingo. So first grade is such a hard grade to shift data in general. And I'm so happy that this article addressed that, like in the first paragraph. I think it addressed the oral reading fluency scores of second graders and first graders. A lot of kids are not where they should be right now. And we need to recognize that as a country. And the reason they're not there yet is because, we're implementing change, but change takes time. So even my first grade data was not where I wanted it to land in the building that I coached this year. I didn't get as many students solid enough as where I wanted. And I felt, I felt like the world was falling apart. What did I do wrong? Is this my fault? But the realization came that this year will be a hell of a lot stronger. And I'll tell you why. My kindergarten data was so much stronger this year because this is not the first year we did it. We've been doing this now for a little while, a year and a half. I know that my first graders that are coming in this year, most of them, a majority, know how to decode a CVC word, whether it's real or fake, seamlessly, with automaticity. They see it because we've put in that work. We've done the work. The teachers get it. Some other things that are going to happen this year. We're going to immediately begin strengthening that core and showing decodable text, not in the middle of the year. We're not going to wait. We're going to start showing that application piece from day one. Now, the other thing that I think is really important, I think a lot of principals right now are really attached to the idea of strengthening the core in tier 1 instruction. I agree. Tier 1 is so important, right? You catch all those little bunny rabbits in the classroom, right? But that does not mean that you could ignore tier 2 and tier 3.
Not sure. Because, wait, Judy, I'm not sure. Debbie, do you know what Judy means by this? Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah. So you can't ignore it because I don't think people realize how laborious and difficult learning how to read is for many students. It doesn't just mean that the teacher's just showing something to the whole class. The teacher still needs to see, okay, let me see what skills my group has. Let me see. They might need to learn that one-to-one correspondence. They might need to learn how to slide to a, through a certain word and decode it. But the other thing that's really important is, we do have learners that are at different points, and we need to also make sure that we're meeting the needs of the kids that did crack the code that Debbie said we will have in our classrooms as well. But I think here's the big problem in a lot of schools. Because a lot of kids have so many gaps, we often have to reteach so many concepts. And unfortunately, because we have to do that, it's a good thing that we're reteaching and not, slowing down. But we often don't get to the things that kids need to do well on something like an oral reading fluency. So I've been really, listening a lot to my friend Wiley Blevin's recommendation, where he said, okay, you might have programs that address things at a certain time based on your scope and sequence. But guess what? That doesn't mean you can expose kids to all 6 syllable types or vowel flexing way earlier. And my professional recommendation, and I'm not a scientist and I'm not a researcher, but I'm a person that's really invested my whole life and being to this, is by middle of first grade, kids should know the way most words work and should be tackling that. By second grade, non-negotiable. And I think that even in kindergarten, we can't just let the kindergartners leave knowing CVC words. They should know vowel flexing and silent E words, and just know vowel flexing in general. What's a breath? What's a macron? What sounds do the vowels make when we see those symbols? So I think that, my professional opinion has really shifted, and I'm thankful to people like you, Debbie, and Wiley and Faith that has helped me get to that point. And I think the main driving force is the kids. When you see kids not being able to do something or being able to do something, that's where the point of reflection really takes off, right?
So Debbie, I see you listening intently to what Judy was saying. I could see it on your face. I know you want to respond. I do want to hear what you have to say about the conclusion of this article, where they do mention the importance of this differentiating with, how it's more important, way more important that we have strict adherence to this, synthetic phonics, decodable books using like 95% decodable with kids who are those fragile learners at this point. And where kids who can fly, maybe you can loosen the reins a bit. Your thoughts?
Right. I drew your attention privately to a post on the message forum of the International Foundation for Effective Reading Instruction, which was focused on me being approached by someone in France saying, we're having this debate. That was years ago. And he drew attention to another person, sadly departed, who did marvelous work in phonics, which is Tom Burkhardt. And on that thread, on that message forum, there's a translation of Tom's message, which goes back to 2001, 2 decades ago, referring to the situation in France. This is why you have to be outspoken in these things, because that's disgraceful. It is chilling. But what Tom does in his talk to the French people is he starts to describe the how. And he takes his program, which was Dancing Bears, and he's describing how he addresses those slower learners. He gets into the practicalities. And I am saying to this international audience, we have to now, all of us, leapfrog into the practicalities that whenever I mention it on my networks, I shut down the thread and nobody answers. Because is it because I'm not an academic? Is it because I'm challenging? Is it because they don't understand what I'm saying? We absolutely need to leapfrog into practicalities. Now, as an aside to what I'm saying, I don't use any of the diacritic things that Jude is referring to, but that doesn't mean they don't work. So another thing that we have to be mindful of is respect to some slightly different approaches to phonics. I never refer to silent E or anything like that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work. And so although I've got my preferred ways, I'm also trying to say I'm taking some of my preferred ways into the conversations, because I am suggesting they're the ways forward, is how we can differentiate with regard to our classroom findings. And I think this is really important. I'm critical of the researchers who are trying to say time limited, because it depends. I am promoting the notion of phonics being an adult lifelong stuff of the most complex alphabetic codes in the world. There's a huge difference between Spanish and English. The difference is profound, right? So we have to equip teachers and parents and carers with this knowledge and information. Because if you are a tutor like Judy's describing, and you are taking older pupils or learners who feel like they are getting baby stuff, that is disgraceful when it's not baby stuff at all. Often they've been let down by the inadequacy of their teaching, not the teachers, because they don't know any better. So we absolutely have to stop treading on eggshells about an analysis of programs and content. We have to get into that. Now, there are groups of what I call the middle tier, advisors and promoters of the science of reading. Now, some of those middle tier people go out of their way not to mention a commercial phonics program. They are going in the business of talking about science of reading, the core criteria, the simple view of reading. They're showing the fancy models, the Scarborough rope and things like that. Beautiful. But then what? Then what do you have in the hands of teachers? Because if you leave it in the hands of just promotion, I use this, I promote that, I like that. What is that teacher? How can that teacher discern? Now, it is long overdue that that middle layer and the teacher training universities start to do a critical analysis of the bodies of work and their associated training and principles to understand what this looks like for Alice and for Josh, right? What does that look like? Because let me tell you something, I open eyes when I get into schools, which I haven't done since COVID and lockdowns, to be honest. I just do online stuff now. But you know how teachers say to a visitor, well, you don't know our children. We know our children, you don't, all right? I have gone into so many schools, and whether I've modelled a mainstream class, and I do say throw all the children in there, not, you know, throw the intervention children in, or whether I've modelled for intervention, maybe 2 or 3 children together who are special needs, and I don't know the children, and I've just picked a point in my body of work to introduce to them, I kid you not, over and over and over again, the adults are absolutely shell-shocked because they say, Debbie, we didn't know the children could do that. So children, I've given myself goosebumps saying that. Children, they thought they knew, and they're maybe doing a phonics intervention, absolutely amaze them with what they can do. And that's included children with Down syndrome and everything. They didn't know. Now, listen to the importance of this. This notion that as teachers, we develop the full potential of children is knocked out. We didn't know their full potential because we're not trained well enough. We're not equipped well enough. We're not experienced well enough with what is possible.
I love that. I love that. And that is 100% true. That I think that we assume they can't because we're following maybe a certain sequence sometimes. I'm like, oh, they're not ready for this. We don't know what they're really ready for because we haven't pushed the envelope a little. And kids, I could tell you in my own tutoring practice, there are kids who have been in an OG approach, and that could take a very, very long time. It doesn't mean it doesn't work, but it can take a very long time. And Wilson could take a very long time. And I'm moving them in less than half the time. And teachers would say, oh, why are you going so quickly? Because they can. Because they can if you're teaching the right way, because they can. So here's what I want
to ask you a question.
Okay, what?
Please. All right, it's been on my mind for a little while. So why did we get so messages when you posted this article online? All of a sudden, some of our besties messaged us. Why? Why was there this messaging going on? And it was good. And I'm excited that people, when they saw the article, reached out. That's what we want to hear. We want to hear more people. Why? What happened?
Because there's a fear in the United States that phonics is a trigger. And we don't want to be called phonicators. Like I was called a phonicator once, like because I promote phonics as being something very important as part of what you do when you teach kids to read.
But why did people get that impression based on this article that was going to be the case?
This, because of the language of the article, it says implementing a strict synthetic phonics method, and it says and that without anything other than decodables that are 95% decodable. And I think people panic thinking that we're going to ignore other parts of reading, even though I read the article to believe that there's just this emphasis in making sure that kids understand the code and how it works early on without a mixed methods approach. That's how I read it, that it was not, everything else should be gone and that we only do phonics
right
in the classroom without looking at vocabulary, without building language, without writing, without spelling, without anything else. I mean,
Can I ask you one more thing, Faith? Do you think part of the concern was also that people don't know if there's enough evidence and research to say that decodables are the way to go? Was that part of it as
think
well?
that there's research now that says that you cannot just use decodables. You're supposed to introduce kids to authentic books. But again, the recipe is not really laid out, as Debbie was saying. It's not like we know for sure. This article does not clarify some of those types of things. So it leaves people wondering and worried that we are looking to turn back the clock by having this conversation. I don't see it that way. I see this as a very important conversation because it is an international concern. Debbie, I want to ask you, have you heard of the Balancing Act? That book that came out by Charlotte Hacking and Dominic Wise. And it's a book that feels, I think, that there's just too much of an emphasis on phonics. And they're saying that this is an evidence-based approach. And it kind of feels very much like a conversation about balanced literacy again. And some people are worried about that happening because balance is a trigger word as well.
Right, yes. These people go back a long way. So, where you've mentioned at the beginning that I've been in this fight for decades, so have they. And so really what you have is a number of quite well-known researchers internationally, not just in the UK context, who a long time ago set their stall out to introduce phonics as it arises in authentic literature, because it's offensive to them to think we do very explicit phonics and we have these decodable reading books. I don't know what happened to their common sense button in their brain, because to be perfectly honest, it's so much common sense to me. Teach them a code and get them to practice on sentences and texts of the code. Why wouldn't we? And so, to be honest, coming at this argument from a teacher and a practitioner, I actually think a lot of these people have got a screw loose with their rationale. So anyway, there you go. So also, I know a researcher that did a very wide, across an authority approach with lots of early rigorous phonics. There's nothing wrong with that, but then apply it into real reading books or authentic text, and the adult just tells them the code or the words that they don't know. But that's not as rich in practice as also providing children with decodable text to apply and extend their phonics knowledge and skills. And why a researcher couldn't take a few schools and say, well, okay, research should have a variable. Let's make the variable that phonics diet, but then with decodables, because that's what a real researcher or a real scientist would do, is to look at that. So I think there's some fight back, and there's some fight back in Australia, isn't there, where people who've set their stall out to teach reading in one way do not want to open their mind to suggest that there might be a more effective way or a better way, or they will, but only for children who struggle. Now, there's that going on. But then there's my argument that we're not doing the promotion of systematic synthetic phonics any favors if in reality the bodies of work are impoverished, because there's a very big gap between practice at a low level and authentic text. So it's looking like that in the English spelling system and in the French spelling system. Now, if you've got your Alice types, they can make that leap, and surprisingly early, but the rest can't. So it will present as if those children need much longer on decodable text because their practice is so impoverished. And so I want to give you a stark example to this. Now, I've been fighting for decades this anti-worksheets anti-workbooks approach. And I thought of a new way to do this recently, because in England's context, it's desperate, because an anti-worksheet, anti-workbook program is now in nearly a third of England's schools. And I'm wondering, Faith, if results are going to go backwards for at least those struggling children. Now, we promote the love of literature. So sometimes, you know, the Dominic Wisers and people like that and pink and fluffy people bang on about, oh, we've got to inculcate that love of literature, the love of books. So the phonics proponents have really been accused unjustifiably of not promoting the love of books, where actually we love books, which is why we want to teach children to read in the first place, if you look at it that way. However, it's really important to think, well, okay, let's look at this from the shoes of the child. And so every single thing I do is from the shoes of the child. If you want to engage children, why wouldn't an activity book where they're reading, practicing the code, can see the code, practicing their words, doing some writing, doing some drawing? It's a high engagement, love of their own activity book. Why wouldn't children love a well-designed, content-rich workbook, activity book? And I'm telling you, they love it. They love their phonics.
And you know what? It's, again, people who are not really understanding the view of the child. When they could break the code, those decodable books are not boring to them. When they could write and fill things out and actually do the work, it's not boring for them if they understand what's expected of them. So I'm so glad we had this conversation. Judy, what are some of your last thoughts, last questions for Debbie as we think of wrapping this up?
Can I ask a fun one?
Excuse me?
Can I ask her a fun one?
Of course.
Have you ever met Princess Diana, Harry, or William? No? You're muted. All right. Another question. You know, actually, I do have another question. I know you mentioned early in the discussion, and then Debbie unmute when you chat with me. You mentioned the term impoverished in relation to decodable in terms of the language. And, you know, Faith has helped me on my journey. I invested a lot of money in decodables and fell in love with a lot of mine. And I'm finding the language in a lot of them is actually better than I expected. I mean, sure, not all decodables are created equally, but can you tell me a little bit more before we go about that term you used about the impoverished language?
Definitely. When you look into the research of how many words children pick up in spoken language, given the opportunity and language-rich homes, they pick up thousands. And I think people fail to realize we're talking thousands. And then also a lot of new words are provided in literature that are not in general spoken language. So literature itself introduces lots of new words. Now, there's an argument for some phonics proponents that we should only use words that children already have in spoken language. And I don't agree with that, because when you provide literature, be it authentic or phonics decodable, I think we can introduce new language. But in any event, with 30 different children with multiple languages, we don't know what their actual spoken language is. And so what we're doing is we're restricting word structure, and we're restricting words, if we're not careful, on the presupposition that little children should have those restrictions, rather than seeing it as an opportunity to introduce some rather strange words. Now, the other thing is with nonsense words. Faith mentioned that we've had a phonics check since 2012 in England, and I promote that internationally. I think we should all be using the same phonics check. Australia eventually managed, some of the states managed to introduce their own version, but then they don't know how the Australian children are doing compared to England. And I actually think in an English spoken country, that's what we should be doing. But we've got a lot of confusion as well from people putting nonsense words in their phonics programs, which they shouldn't, because nonsense words are for assessment, not practice. And people ill-advisedly will put nonsense words in with illegal spelling strings because they don't know any better. Now, if you put novel words in phonics material, they're the equivalent of nonsense word practice, whether the word is known to the child orally or it's a brand new word, they're getting the phonics practice that they need. And in terms of different...
They do that, Judy, in the Word Wasp. In the Word Wasp manual, there are, like Debbie said, words that are not well known, and it's like a nonsense word, but they're still real words.
But you know what? I get it, but the problem with that is I feel, and maybe I'm wrong, I feel that if a kid can decode, a regular CVC word, they should be able to decode a nonsense word. And I think the reason that some teachers have included that in their instruction in the field where I see it is not because, yes, those are meaningful words and so forth, but you can't, universal screeners are seeing if kids can decode a nonsense word, and having it completely as a surprise to a kid if they've never been exposed can really skew your data, because like kids will be like, wait, what is that? I've never seen that before. And that could be very overwhelming for a kid, because what they're getting on a screener like Acadians is a one-page document, and the majority are nonsense words. And if a kid's never ever seen that, that could be very confusing to a child. And we've seen that. And once the kids have been exposed and realized, if I could decode this CVC word, I can decode any word that, follows that, pattern.
Right. Two words there, Judy. The way to address that, for example, in England's context, where children take it at the end of year 1, their phonics screener, which has got 20 real words and 20 alien words or nonsense words, is a couple of weeks before the test, play some games like that.
Right.
I now go back to this notion that I keep banging on about, which is the body of work of your phonics provision or your early reading and writing provision. If it is rich enough, every single lesson you are facing children with new printed words because they've never decoded them before, they're new. And some of those words, at least, will be new to their spoken language, in which case they are the equivalent of nonsense words. But then the teacher can devote some time to vocabulary enrichment. And this is why it's time for this middle layer of advisors and the academics to start to look at what the bodies of work consist of. Because I think that with very rich practice, and I've got another corny phrase, which I call the maths of the phonics. In America, you might call that the math of the phonics, the quantity. If you took some of my phonics programs and track children from their shoes to say, in that session, how much practice did the individual child get from print to sound for code level, word level, text level, and compared it to other phonics programs, the difference is profound. And when that difference is week in and week out, you are going to get a different consequence from that. And when you have a phonics program where the whole ethos is no worksheets, no workbooks, what that leaves is a flashcard routine. So the adult is doing it to the child. When your slower ones slip through the net, and then they're really not on it, they can't learn it from a flashcard. Your Alisons in this world are coasting lesson after lesson. Then they might do a bit of mini whiteboard work for spelling or writing. And then they do reading books. But what's missed is the rich content you would put on a worksheet or in a workbook. There's a whole chunk of activity that's literally missing. It's a hole in their provision. And until such time as people understand that, we will always be able to criticize phonics provision, because the phonics provision, in my view, my opinion, is impoverished.
So we're going to leave it at that. I think we covered a lot here and left people with some food for thought. I love this conversation because it wasn't strictly a yes or no answer. And that's the way it should be. As Debbie said, there should be a respect for what other people are doing. And it's not like there's just one way to do something. But as Debbie said, maybe the people in that middle level need to start talking about, well, are some ways better than others? And if so, it's fair to tell teachers that there are better ways instead of putting everything in the same playing field as if they all work the same way. I, for one, just feel that what we do here in the United States, quite honestly, takes way too long. I'm not saying that it doesn't work, but I have found, and I have followed what they were doing in England for years and looked at their work. And I always felt the UK was really leap years ahead in terms of the practical points. As Debbie said, maybe the research came out of the United States, but we weren't implementing it. But they really were, possibly because it's smaller, it's more doable. I don't know the reasons. I'm not going to get into that now. But I do want to thank Debbie Hepplewhite for joining us. I do encourage you to take a look at phonicsinternational.com, her body of work, her alphabetic codecharts.com. We will put this into the show notes. We do here at the Literacy View have a real respect for many, researchers, many teachers, many programs. We are agnostic in terms of that. We're about what works. And it was beautiful to have this conversation. Thank you for joining us, Debbie. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Judy. Again, I feel very honored and I've really enjoyed that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, please follow us on theliteracyview.com. I'm taking Judy's part right now. Judy.
Why? And join our Facebook group, The Real Teachers Letting Loose the Literacy View. Follow us on YouTube, The Literacy View. Subscribe, share with your friends. Also, new additions, you can donate to us at The Literacy View. We pay for what we're doing. So if you could help us out and show your support, that would be great. And one new feature is you could advertise with The Literacy View. All the guidelines, if you want to advertise with us, are on our website, like Faith just mentioned, theliteracyview.com. Thank you, everybody. Changing lives, one view at a time. Thank you, Debbie.